you studied this stuff in college, so you go way back with this. What got you into this topic? Was this something you grew up and you were just fascinated by the Romans and the Greeks and how they formulated our world, or how'd it go?
I think ancient history buffs are born, not made. It's just there innately.
Mm.
But when I was 14, I went to Rome for the first time with my parents. And I think seeing the Pantheon for the first time, seeing the ancient buildings, I put my hand on something that was 2,000 years old. That might have decided my path, I think, in a lot of ways. That and Rome Total War, that probably helped too.
Rome Total War?
Yeah, I was a big fan of that in high school. But anyway, I became a classical languages major and as an undergrad, got a PhD in ancient history. And at that point, your path is set. You're either a professor or barista at that point with that degree.
Yeah.
Or a YouTuber somehow. And so it was, just kind of serendipity got me here, I guess. But I've been always fascinated by classical civilizations. And there's just so much to study. I think that's part of the appeal, too. The length and depth of ancient history. You never get bored. There's always some new facet, some new era, some new epoch to inquire into.
Yeah, and there's a lot that explains things today because humanity runs in patterns. Obviously, our creations and our innovations change, and certain things we do with each other changes, but behaviors and the way we behave and work together in groups and stuff kind of remains the same. And I was on the phone, I guess like 8 weeks ago, with our mutual friend Luke Caverns, and we were talking about some things that we think are really underreported in podcasting. And one of them obviously is ancient Rome, which really, until now, Lex just got on it the other day with Gregory, who we were trying to get in here as well. But it's not something that's talked about a ton, and yet there are so many parallels we can paint today with Western civilization and what those guys formulated back then.
Yeah, I mean, we're still living Roman history in a lot of ways. They have defined the world that we still inhabit. Everything from our dating system to our language to our laws, our constitution, all of these things are so profoundly shaped by the Romans that to be ignorant of how they operated, of their history, of their ways, is to not know ourselves in some fundamental way.
Yeah, you were telling me right before we got on camera, teasing this to me, but you've done like a lot of work on some of the architecture just regular architecture in New York City compared to Rome, and how that's like modeled after that. What are some of the details there?
Well, sure. Everything from Manhattan's street grid, which is based on Roman city planning, to some of the great monuments. Grand Central Station, very famously, is based on a Roman bath. It has the grand vaulted ceiling of the Baths of Caracalla. The long, late-lamented Penn Station was even more impressive. Many of the pre-war skyscrapers have the mausoleum of Halicarnassus stuck on top. All of these details are borrowed more or less directly from the vocabulary of classical architecture. So all you have to do is start looking, and you just keep finding more and more of these parallels and echoes.
Yeah, and you studied in Rome in college, right? You were telling me you did like some major league program over there with classics. So you lived in the city, and I did as well. I wasn't studying classics at the time, but like we were saying before, it's like you walk everywhere. There's people that live today on these streets and whatever, but there's like history. It's really like you never discover the whole city. You could keep going there forever, and there's just new things all the time.
Yeah, I told you before, this Italian saying that a lifetime is not enough for Rome, and that really is true. I love, there's the Theater of Marcellus, this theater from the age of Augustus, that was converted into a palace in the Renaissance era and is now apartments. So you can live in a Renaissance palace in a Roman theater by the Tiber, which is pretty cool, if you have a lot of money. A huge amount of money.
Maybe one day. We'll invest in that. We'll get this podcast
right,
going. We'll be good. But there's so many places we can start with Rome. I think a very appropriate one to go with would be Julius Caesar, who's obviously in pop culture the most known name from that era. But Caesar existed at a time, as it would turn out, where the empire turned the page from a republic to an empire, right? So this is, I want to say he was killed in like 50 BC, something like that?
44.
Okay, 44 BC. So maybe at the beginning, can we go into who Julius Caesar was, like as a child, what type of family within the class structure he was born into, and how he became who he became?
Sure, yeah. So who he is embedded in his name. So Gaius Julius Caesar. His clan, his nomen, is the Julian clan, Julius. And they're one of Rome's oldest families. In fact, they claim descent from the goddess Venus herself via Iulus, the son of Aeneas, this legendary hero who was himself, descended from Venus. So Julius Caesar comes from this very old family that was, at the time of his birth, kind of marginalized in Roman politics. They had a lot of great names in the distant past, but not many from the more recent decades. And so he had to make his own way in many ways in Roman politics at a time when Roman politics were very, very chaotic. This is when the Republic is kind of beginning its own slow death. This is Marius and Sulla. This is the proscriptions, the civil wars. And Caesar is clever enough to navigate this maze while being part of the Marian party, the party that was championing the plebs, the common people of Rome, against the traditionalists and aristocrats, even though himself is a very blue-blooded guy. And so Caesar finds his way to become the champion of the Roman people when it's dangerous to be a champion of the Roman people. He's clever enough to not be executed in all of this.
Right.
He lives high. He's good at everything he does. But he really doesn't become notable, really a major figure in Roman politics until the first triumvirate, which is in the year 60. And following it, his famous conquest of Gaul. Caesar will lead up to 10 legions and conquer all of what's now France in a series of brilliant and absolutely brutal campaigns that he's smart enough to write up as he's doing them and send them back to Rome as dispatches. He's a good publicist.
What did he write on at the time?
Just papyrus.
Just papyrus.
So from Egypt. It was imported, different qualities. There were markets in Rome you could buy, top-grade papyrus, crap papyrus.
Can we still see this today?
Yeah.
Some of these writings?
Well, not the originals. We have, for Caesar, some early medieval manuscripts, but the originals have vanished. In a humid climate like Europe's, paper and papyrus doesn't last forever. It begins to decay unless it's in a climate-controlled environment. And that didn't exist, of course, in the Middle Ages.
Sure.
So stuff had to be copied out or else it would just disappear. But in Egypt, papyrus does survive almost indefinitely in the right conditions. So we do have papyrus from Egypt that go back to the time of the Old Kingdom, more than almost 5,000 years in some cases.
Wait, why does it survive in Egypt?
Low humidity. So it's so dry there that no microbes breed on the paper and eat into it.
The medieval stuff we have of Caesar, though, you're saying that was some sort of a copy that...
exactly.
So we're confident that it's pretty close to what he actually wrote?
Pretty confident. How it works is we have different manuscripts and different traditions, and they compare them and say, okay, these words all appear here. There's a mistake here. We can guess where that crept in. There are some authors who we only have one manuscript for, and there we don't know how much of it is authentic or original. But we can usually guess from the style or from external sources that it's more or less accurate. But for papyrus from Egypt, we have Homer, the poems of Homer, and we have huge chunks of Homer preserved in papyrus. And they found ways the text had changed, from when that was copied to the Byzantine exemplars that we had. We also found new texts in papyrus that we didn't know that had vanished in the Middle Ages in libraries, but preserved in the sands of Egypt, and then came to light in the 19th century.
Wow.
So pretty cool stuff.
But you were saying he was out there doing conquest in Gaul with 10 legions?
Oh, yeah. So Caesar conquers all of Gaul. He was not supposed to do that. He kind of seized a chance. There was a German tribe that was migrating into Gaul, and he kind of used the disruptions caused by this migration to start a series of wars that conquered this whole vast territory. And brought a huge section of continental Europe under Roman sway. But he was a publicist who knew the advantage of making his exploits known to the people of Rome, who were his key supporters. So he would write in the off-season, in the winters, dispatches from the frontier. Where usually he was writing from southern France or somewhere in there. And these are his famous commentaries on the Gallic Wars, and we still have these. It's often the first text that students read when they learn Latin because he was a master stylist. He wrote very clearly, concisely, but it was exciting. He's showing the battles as they're happening. And he names his soldiers. He's very careful to name the ordinary guys who do courageous things in the battlefield and make things happen. So people appreciate that. He's giving credit to the little guys. It's not just about the aristocrats and the big generals. And so it's through this, a combination of his actual brilliant generalship, and his even more brilliant PR stunts that makes Caesar really well known in Rome and gives him huge amounts of money because the Gallic tribes, though not urban or civilized, quote unquote, in the way the Romans themselves like to imagine they were very wealthy. They had a lot of gold. Caesar takes all of this, thank you very much, and then builds his
The French.
Essentially, yes. Avant la lettre. But takes all their stuff and, builds a forum in Rome, especially these mass barbecues for the people in Rome in tandem with his triumph, which comes later. But of course, when he comes back into Italy, his enemies have been conspiring against him and have recruited Pompey, Rome's other great general, to their cause. And so he famously crosses the Rubicon, which is the southern border of his province, into
river,
Italy itself.
right.
And he had to disband his legions before he crossed, or else he'd be breaking the law. But by crossing with his armies, he was declaring civil war, essentially. Anyway, a brutal civil war ensues in which he defeats Pompey and then spends years defeating Pompey's followers.
Where did they fight that? Like, are they fighting that on damn near the streets of Rome itself, or?
Well, that happened in the previous generation. Like Marius and Sulla had fought right on top of Rome.
Oh, wow.
But that has not happened for Caesar because Pompey and his supporters flee Italy and go to Greece. And so the big battle, the Battle of Pharsalus, happens in northern Greece.
Can we pull that up on a map, Alice?
And actually, fun fact, I was near there once. I was traveling in Greece. And I was talking to somebody. So you can still find like spear tips in the farm fields left over from this.
From that battle.
From that battle. But anyway, so Caesar wins the civil war at long last, and it's again a hard-fought series of battles. The last one in 45 BC is fought in Spain. Actually, he fights in North Africa, he fights all over the Roman world, fights in Egypt too, in the course of which he becomes Cleopatra's lover because he's Caesar and he's irresistible.
But God, I want to stop you every sentence. There's so much here. Keep going.
This guy just gets around. But anyway, so after he finally wins all of these wars, he comes back to Rome. And is in effect, if not in name, a king. But of course, Rome doesn't have kings. They've thrown out their kings 5 centuries before. And he has to decide who he's going to be in this political system. And so he becomes a dictator for life. And dictator does not have the connotation it does today. We think of a strong man who is brutal and vicious. Yeah. In the Roman system, a dictator is someone who is given temporary control of the state in a time of emergency. And he then lays down his powers at the end of his, a short term typically.
Because that's what they all do.
Well, yeah. Well, actually, some of them did.
Really?
Yeah, yes. Like the famous Cincinnatus, after whom Cincinnati is named indirectly, is a Roman farmer who, is told, this is in the depths of Roman history, that, hey, our enemies are coming, and he's out plowing his field. So, he wipes off the sweat off his brow, puts on his armor, leads an army, and is back in a week at his fields. But he's kind of the exception. Caesar has no intention of giving up power.
That sounds like Maximus a little bit.
And he's kind of modeled on.
I don't want to be in charge of Rome.
Yeah, with my crops, right? And he's in the wheat field, Exactly. And that's the same thing. And so Caesar, though, is not a wheat field guy. He's a world conquest kind of guy. And so he decides that Rome is too dangerous for him. He's going to go off and conquer the Parthians, conquer Persia, like Alexander, who's Caesar's personal hero. But before he can do that, he's assassinated famously on the Ides of March, 44 BC, by a coalition of senators who thought he had too much power.
Stabbed him in the back.
Many times. And that's the end of Caesar. But of course, his example sets the tone for the rest of Roman history because it's his nephew, his adopted heir, Octavian, the future Augustus, who becomes the first emperor. And he uses Caesar's playbook in all kinds of ways. He recruits the people of Rome to his cause. But he's more careful than Caesar. Caesar called himself a dictator and was a king in all but name. Octavian is princeps, first citizen, and has all the power of a king without the name and titles of a king. And it's this kind of fiction that makes him acceptable to the aristocracy of Rome and becomes kind of the MO for a long ways in Rome.
Yeah, and this is just a personal opinion with looking at the history. I think Octavian... Obviously, Caesar gets all the attention because he was the real turn of the page there, and he was obviously famously killed, and it gets compared to any other major political assassination that would come after it. It's always tied back to Caesar. But the really fascinating emperor, if you will, to me is Augustus, because he brings in this period of Pax Romana, and yet he also is very politically savvy in the sense that he pushes out any dissidents, and we'll get into all that. Like he's fascinating, but starting with Caesar is interesting because of what happened with his fall and how that changed the empire. But you keep mentioning it, so we should go back to it. The idea of how Rome had been set up for so long before that, I think you said it, they kicked out the kings 5 centuries before
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. So when we look at America with our democratic and republic mixed principles, some of the I guess aspects are derived from those first 500 years of Rome, no?
They are. So the Constitution's framers were trying to create a perfected Roman Republic, basically. They read this guy Polybius, a Greek historian who had described the Republic in its heyday, in the time of Scipio and the wars against Hannibal.
Scipio Africanus.
Scipio Africanus, exactly. And looked at that, looked at other ancient political theory, and tried to create a version that would not devolve into tyranny, whence the checks and balances. And of course, they're influenced by later thinkers, John Locke, Montesquieu, all these people. But the idea of a republic that rules a large area and is tyrant-proof is very, very heavily influenced by Rome. Of course, ours is a democratic republic. Rome's was very much oligarchic in a way that ours at least pretends not to be.
Pretends.
Right. but still, the principles of the system are very heavily influenced by the Romans, and very transparently. They're trying to create a new and better Roman Republic.
How was the Roman Republic set up, politically speaking? Like, what were the most important layers of their government and who had power?
It's basically an aristocratic power-sharing system. The whole system is designed to allow a set number of families, in effect a few dozen, share power peacefully. That's why it's an oligarchy. It has democratic elements. There are assemblies of the people who vote for important officials. But really when it comes down to it, everyone who has power is almost always a member of one of a few important families. Every position is both collegial, has more than one guy holding it, so they're afraid of one person having too much power, and is annual. It lasts for 1 year. And so the consuls are on top, the 2 consuls. They're elected every year. Originally, they spent most of their time leading armies outside of Rome. Eventually, they spend more and more time around the capital. But they're the praetors beneath them, the quaestors, the aediles. But all of these guys are in colleges. That is, there are many of them at one position, and they have terms for 1 year because the whole idea of the position is to allow the maximum number of aristocrats have power and the honor that comes from that power without civil war. And when it falls apart is when guys start breaking the rules of the system to grab too much power, to keep power beyond the 1 year limit, to kind of trample on the feet of their fellows. So for the common people, the republic is probably not all that different from the monarchy or from the empire that comes after it. But for the aristocracy, the ones who write the histories, the republic is a pretty great time because it allows them a chance to shine.
It at least spreads some of the wealth.
Right, it shares
so
the
to
wealth.
speak.
And Augustus is part of his genius is to realize that they need this sort of outlet. They need this chance to make a name. So he gives them governorships of the provinces. He makes them generals. He allows them to have real power, but with him,
Like the families, but he's
still on top, right? So they can't celebrate triumphs, for example, these famous victory parades.
Where was, because like when people think of the word empire, they imagine it has a lot of geography and a lot of land, which it did. And can we actually pull up a map of the Roman Empire at its peak, Alessi? I don't care what year it is, just like at its peak of size.
Yeah, they always do like 117, the death of Trajan.
Of course you know what it is.
Yeah, I'm in the business.
It's kind of your job.
Yeah, that's
All
what
right,
I
let's
do.
take a look at this real quick.
There it is. Yeah, it's the famous map.
Just to get an idea. So, yeah, you can see they have all of mainland Europe, including Britannia, which I believe Caesar was never able to get to. He had to turn around. Is that right?
No, he invaded it twice, actually. He didn't conquer it.
Right, he didn't conquer it.
It was sort of a PR thing again. He wanted to see he crossed the ocean, the English Channel. And so he does. He whips a bunch of chieftains and then goes back to Gaul. It's wait until the reign of Claudius, a century later, they conquer Britain.
Got it. We'll come back to that. Yeah. So you can see it has mainland at its peak in 117 AD. It has mainland Europe. It has all of Western Asia. It has all of Northern Africa, basically where the diaspora of people from what we know about the earliest parts of human history had spread out to.
In a lot of ways. Yeah, in the Mediterranean world for sure.
Yeah, like Rome has a significant portion of land here. But before they were the empire, meaning before, say, Caesar and the first triumvirate at least comes in, how much of this, they had a lot of land.
Well, they did. I mean, so they
when they were a republic.
So they conquer all of Italy over the course of the 3rd century BC. So by the time Hannibal shows up, for example, all of Italy has been conquered by the Romans, south of the Alps. They've also conquered Sicily from the Carthaginians in the First Punic War. That's their first province.
When was that?
The First Punic War
Yeah.
is 264 to 241 BC.
Okay.
But then so that's a generation before Hannibal. And then after, but it's really the war with Hannibal that gives them their first large provinces. Because after they defeat Hannibal, they gain Carthaginian Spain. And they end up seizing Sardinia a little before that, and parts of North Africa kind of become into their orbit. The famous year for expansion for the Romans is 146 BC. So in the same year, they take Carthage, their great rival, and
Which is now in northern Africa.
which is now in Tunisia, very near Tunis.
Yep.
And they also destroy Corinth in Greece, which is the wealthiest of the Greek cities. And so there are two different Roman armies destroying two famous cities at the same time. And so Greece becomes a province, Africa's a province now, and the Mediterranean's a Roman lake at that point. There are kingdoms in the east that were founded by the generals of Alexander centuries before that had the phalanxes, the famous ranks of men with the long sarissas.
Yep.
But the Roman legion's more flexible, and they defeat them, kill their war elephants. No one can stand up against the legions for centuries and after century. And so the Romans are really their own worst enemies for much of our period. It's their civil wars that cause the most bloodshed.
But essentially, while they're a republic in this shared power structure, what I was getting at is they're doing empire-esque things.
Oh, yes,
obviously.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, because they're expanding their reign significantly during that entire time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they have an empire before they are the empire, as we describe it. Because that just means they have emperors, really.
Yeah.
The Republic's very good at conquering territory. Not so good at governing it, it turns out, but really good at just destroying enemies and seizing their stuff.
Yeah, one of the, you just highlighted it in your breakdown there, but one of the parts of the Roman heel that is so fascinating to me is Carthage. I feel like that's a part of history that is forgotten. So can you go into how Carthage formed as their own empire before they eventually got taken down? I'd love to get to where it's Hannibal and some of those battles happened.
Yeah, so the Carthaginians are settlers from Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. The city of Tyre is the mother city of Carthage. And they originally are merchants who established themselves on the coast of North Africa to trade with the locals, the tribes who had inhabited that territory for thousands of years, and to establish other merchant colonies in Spain and Sicily, which are wealthy territories, and form a trade network back with the mother country in the eastern Mediterranean. But Carthage soon evolves beyond its merchant origins into an empire of its own. It forms allegiances with the Numidians just to the south, these famous horsemen. They conquer parts of Spain, which is very wealthy, very wealthy in gold and silver mines. They conquer part of Sicily. So by the time the Romans are expanding in their own right into southern Italy, where there are a lot of Greek cities, Greek colonies, they're encountering the Carthaginians, who are there already, with their own empire, which includes the western half of Sicily, much of North Africa, big chunks of Spain, and is incredibly wealthy from their merchant ventures. They were not a militaristic people in the way the Romans were. The Romans really fetishized war. Their whole society was built around war. The year began with the campaign season, March 1st. The Carthaginians are always merchants at heart, kind of like the Venetians would be later on. And so they hire mercenaries. Most of their armies are hired. The Numidians, above all, the Spanish tribes they use. So like Hannibal's army is very, very polyglot. It has people from northern Italy, people from what's now France, people from Spain, people from North Africa, but not many Carthaginians. They might lead the armies, but they prefer to outsource their battles, to hire mercenaries. And they're rich enough that they can do this pretty effectively. So in the First Punic War, which is the first time Rome and Carthage really clashed, it's over Sicily for the most part. Carthage has a great navy, and Rome has no navy. So at first, Carthage has the advantage. But then the Romans famously invent this thing called the corvus. It's a big boarding bridge with a big spike at the end. And they can slam down on the Carthaginian ship and fight a land battle at sea, which they're very good at. But anyway, Carthage loses that first war and loses Sicily at the same time. Supposedly Hamilcar Barca, the great general in the last part of the war for the Carthaginians, makes his young son Hannibal swear that he will avenge this defeat and fight the Romans. We don't know if it's true, but Hannibal does end up doing this, and he's a very, very good general who famously crosses the Alps, which no one thought you would be able to do in winter, outside of the main season when the passes are open, with elephants. Recruits, he started with about 20 of them. Only one survived, though, after the first couple of years. It's kind of a fun story. He had most of the elephants the Carthaginians used are North African elephants, which are now an extinct subspecies of the African elephant. They were smaller than the big bush elephant is today, but they were much more trainable, apparently. They're like really big horses. And they also had some elephants from Syria, and these are a little bit bigger. So Hannibal rode.
Syria had elephants?
Well, they'd imported them from India.
Okay, I was
So
gonna say.
the Hellenistic kings.
Yeah, unless he's got a picture right there.
Oh, there we go. Yes. So Hannibal rode the big elephant from Syria, which was called Surus, just the Syrian elephant. And eventually he lost one eye, Hannibal, after a bout of fever, and so he kind of would spend a lot of time riding on the elephant at the head of his troops. Must have been very picturesque. But anyway, I got ahead of myself there.
That was good.
In any case, Hannibal leads this motley army of all kinds of mercenaries and recruits from Europe, from Africa, all over the place, over the Alps into northern Italy, and crushes the Romans in a series of battles that should have destroyed the Roman Republic. It's only the fact that they can keep throwing men into this fight, that they don't give up, first of all, the Senate. They refuse to make any treaty with Hannibal. And they have
And
these...
their people are not mercenaries, as you pointed out. These are
citi-
regular Romans who are about it.
citizens and allies. Yeah, so usually in a democracy, like Rome kind of is, you can't do this. You kill too many people, the people want to change a regime, they demand a peace treaty. But the Republic is both unresponsive enough to that kind of pressure and has these huge reserves of manpower. Because what the Romans did as they conquered Italy is they would levy tribute from these new allies, as they called them, the people they conquered, in both money and in men. And so after they conquered a people, their soldiers became part of the Roman army, at least in theory. They could levy them, saying, hey, we're doing a campaign against Lucania, whatever, next year. You guys send 15,000 of your men to join our army next spring. And that's your tribute for the year.
And but here's the thing. That feels like semantics to me, because in some ways that's kind of like the mercenary setup, because it's like, well, now they're a part of the empire. You know, you're on our team now, like you're on the Yankees, but were you yesterday?
I mean, yes and no. So it's true that, these allies are sometimes just like the guy they were fighting last year. But often they've been allies for decades or even centuries. So they've been fighting with the Romans for a very long time. And they're used to fighting with the Romans. They fight the same way. They're equipped the same way as the legionaries. So they have a good sense of how this all works, and they're very cohesive. So even though they're not Romans technically, they usually speak a language that's similar to Latin, if not actually Latin, and they think of themselves as part of this state. They share in the wealth. Whenever the empire conquers somebody new, conquers a new enemy, the allies get part of the money.
Whoa.
And so they're not just mercenaries, so they kind of operate like them, even though they're levied forcibly originally. They're really part of the system. And there's tens of thousands of these guys. So even though the Romans lose huge amounts, like Trasimene and Cannae, all these famous battles, they can keep making new armies from these allies and from their own citizens. But by the end, even the allies are running dry. They've lost so many guys. And they just don't give up. They hire a dictator. I mentioned these guys who are appointed temporarily for a crisis like this, named Fabius Maximus, who earns the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. So he knows that Hannibal's a better general than he is. He just doesn't fight the guy. So he just kind of avoids battle for year after year. And it drives...
How do you avoid battle? Just like run the other way?
You kind of just like shadow Hannibal. You snipe at him pretty much. Like he's marching along, you march 15 miles behind and send your skirmishers to like nip at his flanks. And when he turns around to face you, you kind of take it to the hills. So it's
God, it's so awkward.
Yeah, it's not a noble way to wage war, but it was an effective one against Hannibal because his army begins to wither away. He's stuck in Italy now. He has no support from Carthage. And even though a few allies have gone over to him, most of Rome's supporters stay firm. They don't go over to the Hannibalic camp. And so he has Capua, a city that Spartacus later raised near the Bay of Naples, but not much else. And so he's increasingly isolated in Italy, and they just wait until he no longer has a base from which he can support himself, and he's forced to leave Italy. At the same time, the Romans...
It's crazy that he's just floating around.
Yeah, he's just hanging out in Italy for like 15 years.
Wow. Can you imagine that today?
Yeah.
Chinese army's just hanging out.
It's just Hannibal. Hey, Hannibal. This whole thing. And of course, the Romans have their own hero now, Scipio Africanus. I
love how the guy says that in Gladiator. And from the four legions, Scipio Africanus.
Kind of like his wig, too.
The wig's great.
Yeah. Well, wig's key. But anyway, Scipio had conquered Carthaginian Spain in the meantime. And then he takes the war to Carthage. He brings an army, it sails, lands in Tunisia, and marches on Carthage itself. They recall Hannibal at long last. And they fight the great conclusive battle at Zama, not too far from Carthage.
Before we get to Zama, I just want to stay with what you just said. So when you say Scipio comes in and conquers Spain. I think the really hard part in me looking at any parts of this ancient history is the fact that we are talking at this point 1700 years or 1600 years before there's a printing press, right? Like there's so many things that are still archaic as far as communication goes between people. How do you just like walk, like look at how fucking big Spain is. Like how do you just walk into Spain, like conquer, I don't know, 100,000 person army in one town and be like, all right, the rest is ours. And everyone around Spain just knows like, oh yeah, these guys. Like how does that even work?
That's a good question. And honestly, there's a doubt sometimes in the Roman period, if the empire's been established for many centuries, people don't know who the emperor is. Like there's a famous story about a guy in Egypt who asks some peasants, who the emperor is. They're like, I don't know, Agamemnon, from like Greek myth. Even though they have coins of the emperor, they have statues of the emperor, they're just so distant from everything.
It's like the old Howard Stern show when you go say, who's the president right now?
Yeah,
I don't know, Clinton.
Yeah, exactly, right. And
it's been Bush for the last 8, my guy.
And that's just it. Out in the boonies, they don't know.
Yeah.
But the major cities are connected, even before the Roman roads exist. So horsemen, obviously, there are fast boats going between them. There are messenger pigeons.
Messenger pigeons.
Yeah, those exist in the ancient world.
What is this like the Harry Potter owl? Like tie a fucking letter to its leg and it goes?
Like that, pretty much, but like somehow less magical and everything. But yeah. So there actually are carrier pigeons. There aren't a ton of them. They aren't used very widely because the messengers are much more reliable, obviously. But they do exist.
And they go where they tell them to go.
Yeah, so you have to train a pigeon like that. You have to they're homing pigeons. They go back to their nest. So you release them, they go back to where they were fed last. And so you don't want to feed them for a long time, or you feed them like in their cage. You don't let them get out and nest anywhere. So the moment you release them, they go back to their initial nest in Rome, wherever that might be. And so you try to keep your pigeons on the edge, I guess.
I need to point this out right now. I went on my buddy Mark Gagnon's podcast recently, and on there I was explaining to him how pigeons are like one of the top 10 smartest animals, to which he told me that was bullshit and said it was pigeon propaganda, and he's been giving me shit about it ever since, even though I've shown him sources that show this. And I just want to point out, we're talking about Roman pigeons flying messages across countries right now. I am in the correct here, Mark. I don't want to hear it anymore. That's crazy. So they would incentivize them with food basically, and they'd be able to get Can you imagine a message going from like even New York City to like DC, like landing on Biden's doorstep? Like, oh, wow.
Well, there was even into like the 20th century. There's a famous pigeongram stamp. So I think it was New Zealand. They had some outlying island that was hard to reach any other way, and they had trained pigeons to fly back to New Zealand or wherever it was. And they had special stamps for the letters. They were pigeongram. So this continued until the modern period.
And now we got Instagram.
And now we have Instagram, the OG or OP, I guess.
So they would maintain some level of control by things like this. You mentioned something about boats too.
Yeah, so boats are the most reliable transportation method in the ancient world. And so if you're trying to connect 2 points and it's summer, there's not a lot of storms that there are in the winter season, boat's the best way to go if it's anywhere around the Mediterranean. So for the Spain, even though it is a huge mountainous place, the coast is not too far from Italy.
Right.
And so you're probably only a 10-day voyage with normal winds from Rome itself and most parts of Spain if you're on the coast. And so that's probably the way they got most of their messages back. And then later on, horses can also go 100 miles in a day easily if you have some kind of decent road.
Right.
Which they usually don't. So the boat's the way to go, or the pigeon.
Right. When did horses first become a thing?
I mean, well before the Romans showed up.
Yeah. It was a long time before, right?
They're definitely, the Greeks have them before then, the peoples of the Near East. They're domesticated, I think, in Central Asia, way before the classical period. And they're pretty widespread in the Mediterranean world before the Romans show up. There were some new animals. So the chicken is a newcomer for the Romans.
Really?
Yeah. The chicken,
when did that happen?
So, I mean, probably like 400 BC in Italy, give or take. They came from the East. They're from Southeast Asia, chickens originally. They were brought to Greece in the classical period as for cockfighting, basically.
Nice.
And eventually they were good to eat too. They kind of got there, and then so the chicken spread pretty rapidly after that across the the Mediterranean world. But they were new. Which is kind of interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like little dinosaurs, those things. If they were bigger, we'd all be fucked.
Oh, absolutely.
Like
They're
they're out of their
terrifying.
minds.
Yeah. I have a 2-year-old niece who does chicken noise. It's like that, the
Yeah.
dinosaur thing, and it's unsettling.
It's so close. They even look like it too, like with the gobbler and all that as well. I mean,
Well, I mean, birds are dinosaurs. So
that's what I'm saying.
that's what we're told. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
some of them certainly feel that way. That's why I eat chicken every day. I don't feel bad about it at all.
you're fighting the good fight.
Yeah, there's enough of them. Like we got to keep them humble, So, but I was getting into this obviously because we were talking about how you maintain control.
Yes.
Of something so far. So when they would get word back to Rome, first of all, maybe in this time period, 200 or 300 BC, like what kind of population size are we looking at in Rome?
In Rome itself. We aren't totally sure. Rome was growing rapidly at the time of the Second Punic War. There was a lot of refugees, of course, from the rest of Italy there. So again, I'm just throwing out a number here. It's not unrealistic. We could be talking 100,000 people in Rome at this point. Not where it would be, it would be 10 times that size under Augustus. A million people.
Yeah.
But it wasn't close to that yet, but quite large by ancient standards.
And back then, 100,000 people, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
So just hypothetical situation here with conquering Spain. They get word back to Rome, maybe by boat, 15 days after it got conquered.
Sure, whatever it might be.
Something like that. They don't have a printing press. So are there just like messengers running around town going, "Hey, we took Spain," and people are just like, "Oh, bet, cool."
Yeah, well, there are a few ways. There are criers. Do you watch HBO's Rome by chance?
I think I saw like an episode at one point. I haven't really watched it. No.
Well, there's this big portly dude who's like, who announces the news. And he's the newsreader, and he's a big part of the show. So like, Pompey defeated. And he has these very theatrical gestures, which they actually did use in ancient oratory. So there are these guys, criers basically, who would, call out the news. There was also a thing called the Acta Diurna, the Acts of the Senate, that was published in the sense that it was written out in certain public places. But of course, literacy is quite low, maybe 10%, probably even lower than that.
Yeah.
So there's no widespread newspapers. So word of mouth probably is most of the dissemination of any information.
But then, from Rome, it's got to get to all the little towns around Rome and all the little towns around them and then all the states around them that are filled with towns just like this and cities just like this. Like, how long? If I conquer someone in Spain in 250 BC, might it be like 3 years before they find out in Jerusalem?
We actually can trace this to some degree. From Egypt, we have these papyri, which are preserved, that preserve mundane things like, the acts of the village council or tax records. And in Egypt, we can know how soon they could tell an emperor was assassinated or a new emperor had come to power, because they date their, whatever they're doing, their acts or the day's edict, by the emperor's reign. And so when they switch over from Emperor A to Emperor B, they know the emperor has been killed. And we actually trace the spread of news from Alexandria, the city on the coast.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time sometimes. It goes up the Nile first, as you'd expect. So they hear about it there pretty quickly. But out in the oases in the desert, it might be months and months after Alexandria knows, only 100 miles away, that they discover the emperor's changed. And so, news moves at the speed of commerce for the most part. That merchants bring the news with them as they go along. And they can travel pretty fast on ships. So a big port city will know what's going on, even in Spain, pretty quickly, about as fast as the ships can sail.
But also the ability to spread fake news.
It's a thing.
It's so easy back then. Do you have good examples of that?
Sure. So after Nero was assassinated, there are 3 false Neros. People keep thinking he's not actually dead. He's hiding somewhere or other. And somebody looks kind of like Nero will show up like, "Oh, it's Nero." And it's like, some like kind of chubby dude with a lyre. And it's like, "Oh, yeah, it's Nero, right?" And he's like, "Yes, I am Nero." And he has like developed a following, like a whole army show up around, fake Nero. And they have to like put down these rebellions again and again. So that wouldn't happen probably today. It's a little harder to pull that off in a, well, maybe, hopefully it is, in a modern media
tell the
setting.
CIA that.
Yeah,
They got some good masks over there.
They do, yeah, the SAM masks or whatever.
But it's funny back then because it would be just like random, like, when you see someone on social media where people take pictures with him, they think it's like The Rock.
Yeah.
And he's like, wow, they really think I'm The Rock. And it's clearly not The Rock.
Well, and that's the thing, because all they have is the coin, usually, to work from. Or maybe like a really bad statue of the emperor. There's a famous story about this governor of Hadrian who is sailing around the Black Sea, looking at all the fortifications there, inspecting them. And he sees a statue of Hadrian that's really, really bad. And he like writes Henry, he's like, hey, can you send a statue here to get a better one? You don't want to see this thing, man. And so they did know what the emperor looked like. They knew he had a beard, maybe. They knew kind of. He's like an older dude, but that was it. They almost no one would ever see the guy.
Yeah, if you're not there in Rome and you don't like go to the Colosseum or something like that,
Right.
like when do you even?
You just don't.
There's no pictures.
And so, when the emperor actually does move, which happens on campaigns, for example, it's a huge event. People come from miles around to see him, to try and get him to, hear their petitions, whatever else. But that's their one touch of the imperial power. They'll pay taxes, of course. They'll see soldiers, but to them, the emperor is very, very far away.
How did taxes work in ancient Rome, the Republic, if you will?
It's a very diverse system. The Romans are kind of conservative when it comes to things like taxes or institutions. If they conquer a territory that has an established tax system, they'll keep it in place, pretty much. They don't bother to change it. Because it's like, it's working. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, pretty much.
Right.
And so there's a huge variety of ways to pay taxes. Like in Egypt, a lot of it's in grain. Because Rome needs grain to feed all those millions of people. And so they send grain by way of tax right to the city of Rome itself. Under the Republic, people are taxed. These soldiers who are levied and become allies for the legions. Some people pay in sheep. But a lot of them pay in actual money.
You telling me pasta came from Egypt?
I mean, indirectly, yeah.
That's ruining my life right now.
But just the grain though. Yeah, pasta comes later. It's a medieval thing, really.
All right.
But so you're safe. Yeah, you don't have to destroy your entire mental universe there. Yeah.
Good. That was going to change everything for me. So they're basically, it's like old school, almost like it's not like they didn't have money. They did, but it's a far simpler society at the time, focused on literally the highest level things like sustenance and people's ability to eat within the empire. So raw materials and base materials are effectively serving as balance sheets fillers at the time.
In a lot of ways. And actually, even later in the empire, when inflation becomes a big problem, they get around that by commuting a lot of taxes to taxes in kind. Things like, the sheep or hides, to make shields for the legionaries. And so there are actually like state-sponsored factories to which they send these raw materials, and they're processed into armor or whatever else they're making, tunics for the soldiers.
Whoa.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we had put a pin in the Battle of Zama.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We were talking
Hannibal.
about that, yes.
Yeah, I brought you back. That was my bad. But so that's where they pull Hannibal back from Italy.
Back to Africa.
And Scipio Africanus is there.
Right. And they have a grand confrontation. And it's the Numidians, those horsemen who the Carthaginians had used for centuries as mercenaries, go over to the Romans. And that's a critical part of the win.
Why'd they go over?
They knew that Hannibal was going to lose, or that it was a losing side. The Romans obviously had the upper hand at this point, and Massinissa, the Numidian king, befriended Scipio Africanus and was a pretty shrewd politician, kind of saw which way the wind was blowing. And he's like, hey, I've got a bunch of really fast horses. Do you want them? And he's like, yes, I do. And that really wins the Battle of Zama. Hannibal's defeated decisively, and Carthage loses its entire empire, besides the little chunk around the city itself.
How big are those armies when they're fighting?
I don't know offhand the numbers at Zama, but they're not huge. Like maybe like 30,000 on a side. I mean, that's big for an ancient battle.
Yeah.
The biggest armies we see in ancient sources are those of the Persians, who fight the Greeks, like in the classical period. Xerxes and his millions crossing the Hellespont, that sort of thing. Even those armies, which are the biggest ones to that point in world history, are probably maybe 100,000 tops. It's so hard to supply an army that size in the field. You need to have a whole convoys of supply ships bringing grain.
How would they do that? That's crazy.
Well, like the Persians supposedly established supply depots all along their march. They planned a year in advance and said, okay, we're going to establish a cache of grain here. We're going to mark a spring here. So that when the armies show up in their multitudes, they know where the food is and they have water waiting for them. But if you're just campaigning, it's not a planned march, just following the enemy somewhere, you can't do that. And so really, operational size tends to be a lot smaller than in modern armies.
At this point, when they're fighting this battle, what types of weaponry are we working with? Obviously, we have swords and things like that, but what other notable things do we have?
So the standard Roman weapons, the classic ones, are the gladius, the short sword, from which we get gladiator, of course. It's a short stabbing sword that's adapted from actually the swords of Spain, the swords of the Spanish tribes. There's the pilum, the throwing javelin, So you don't use it like a spear. You don't thrust with it again and again. You just throw it once. And later on, it's designed to bend on contact so that it can't be reused and thrown back by the enemy. So like the tip will like bend and either like embed in someone's flesh or like latch onto their shield. So their shield is useless. They have to drop it at that point. So it's a very useful thing. Often they'll carry 2 pila and then the short sword.
Can we pull that up? A pila? What's that?
A
P-I-L-A?
pilum, Pilum is the singular.
Pilum. So that's what in the architecture would make it bend on
I think
hit?
There's like a narrow point in the tip that like so it tends like to go in so far. So you see how it's like got a long metal shaft like that.
Right. Okay.
But anyway, it's designed so that it can't be thrown more than once, ideally. And then there's all kinds of auxiliary units. So like these allies are often just fighting like the Romans. They're equipped like the Romans as heavy infantry. The legions are heavy infantry. That's their whole thing. But along with them are cavalry units that are anything from slingers to javelineers.
Slingers?
Yeah. So like there are some cultures, different. Some become very famous who serve as slingers, and it could be as effective as a bullet in some way. It's they're lead slingshots, and whip it in the leather thong and fire it off, and it's it's pretty deadly. Sometimes actually they would imprint slogans on the slingstone, which is kind of fun. So there's a famous one. There's a siege during the wars that followed the death of Caesar, and they were besieging Mark Antony and his wife in this Italian city. And this one's like, this stone's coming for your asshole, Antony. Things like that. They put it on the lead of the slingstone and they, fire it in. It's kind of fun.
That's cool.
Anyway, so a huge range of ranged weapons, basically, alongside the core, which is the heavy infantry of the legions. And they're all about close combat fighting. After they throw those first 2, how it tends to work, at least in the imperial era, so they have their 2 javelins. They get within 100 yards, throw those 2 javelins and try and disable some shields and some men, ideally, on the enemy side, then draw their swords, and the rest of it is all close quarter fighting. And they rely on their superior discipline and cohesion as a unit to win out against the enemies. So really the Romans rely on their heavy infantry to hold the enemy's center, whoever they're engaging, while their other lighter units are usually allies, and they're called auxiliaries in the imperial era when it becomes professionalized, who are often either lighter infantry, cavalry, whatever else, more mobile units to come around, get behind the enemy, and really disrupt their formation.
Right. So like at the Battle of Zama, how many days does something like this go on?
I think it's over the course of 2 days. Again,
not crazy long.
No. Usually it's a one-day thing. Usually engagements are pretty quick, only a few hours. So you think of how heavy the armor is and how heavy the weapons are. You can't keep that going all day. It happens sometimes, but it's not very effective.
And like, if they have a multi-day battle, though, is it like, we see some of these funny stories sometimes, like in World War I, you can see pictures of the Germans and the French playing and British playing soccer together because there were wolves. So they said, all right, we're not going to fight today. They play soccer or whatever, and then the next day they go back to killing each other. Is it kind of similar then, too? Like if people have been battling for 6 hours and there's a lot of death and people are tired and shit, they go, all right, we're going to go over here. You guys are going to go over there. Everyone chill?
Well, there are truces to recover the dead, above all. So like after, it's going on for a day especially. If it's going to be a multi-day engagement, they'll have a truce to recover their fallen from the battlefield. And they'll both be in the field at the same time, just picking up, the wounded above all.
So bizarre.
And during civil wars, when everyone's speaking Latin, there is definitely fraternization, between units, people who knew each other. But those are often the hardest fought wars because they're fighting the same way. And so it's, totally symmetrical warfare, and it gets pretty bloody.
Isn't it crazy how this is a human history thing, how wars are fought between a bunch of dudes who are sent there by a few dudes in an office who just disagree with each other.
Yeah, that's modern history in a nutshell, honestly.
It's 100% it. It's like you're not really, at the end of the day, like most of these guys, they're just following orders. Like, okay, well, I'm part of this country or this thing, so I guess I got to fight this battle. But, they see, hey, Steve, what are you doing here? And Steve's like ready to kill them the next day.
Right.
It's kind of sick.
Well, it is. And in the Civil Wars, there are all kinds of anecdotes about people, brothers killing brothers, friends killing friends. And you're not really fighting for a principle. You're fighting for just this general or that general. They're both Roman. They both stand for the same thing. So it's kind of hard to be too fired up about that. You just hope that your guy pays you better in
So
the end.
they stood in a lot of these. They stood for like the same thing. They just wanted power. That was it.
Pretty much.
Because like you could argue the Civil War. Obviously, you would argue the Civil War in the United States.
Our Civil War,
totally
yes,
different.
there are very important principles at stake. But in the Roman Civil Wars, in the era of Caesar, it's just who's on top. That's it. Whether it's Caesar or Pompey, or Augustus or Anthony. So really, there might be long-term differences in how things might have turned out if General A or General B becomes emperor. But for the guy who's fighting, it's the same general package.
How did the Roman public feel about the initial first triumvirate coming in, which is really where it starts to turn from republic to empire? Not officially, but like, we're down that path. How was that? Obviously, you said Caesar was well respected across the burgeoning empire, but how did they sell that as like, hey, this is kind of the same thing, don't worry about it?
Well, the important thing is they didn't sell it. It was an unofficial agreement. So they kind of, made this arrangement, and everyone kind of knew about it, but it wasn't like, it was ratified by the people. It just was a working agreement between three very ambitious men. And all of them benefited from this agreement, and so they held to it as long as they did benefit from it.
Who were the other two again?
Pompey and Crassus.
And
Crassus gets killed in Parthia when he tries to go off and conquer that Eastern Empire. And of course,
he was a general.
He wanted to be a general. He was famously Rome's wealthiest man. It's like richest Crassus is one of these old expressions that no one uses anymore, but they did at one point. And
I was going to say, I haven't heard that
yeah,
one.
no.
Maybe they say that out in Chicago, but not here.
Yeah, no. And the libraries at Cambridge, pretty much, nowhere else.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was famous as a real estate speculator who would do literal fire sales. He would buy houses as they were burning down. And he had his own squad of firefighting slaves who would then put out the fires, fix it up, and make a good bargain on the price, of course. The owner is watching his house burn down. So unscrupulous, let's say, is a good word for Crassus.
I'll give you $5. Okay,
Yeah,
deal.
yeah, all right.
Put it out. We're good.
Yeah.
It's worth 20.
All right, boys, at it. And then they come running in. He also famously defeated Spartacus, and that was 13 years before all this had started. But he was never really a general. He was a businessman who wanted glory that comes from winning battles.
So he wore the armor. He tried to go out there and be that, but you're saying he wasn't that guy.
Yeah, he spent most of his time being a businessman. Where Caesar, is a politician at heart, but is a very gifted general. And so is Pompey.
Right.
Crassus is not really a general. He's just, someone who knows what you have to do in the Roman system to get credit.
So because Crassus is a part of the triumvirate, him becoming a general, he had, I'm guessing here, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, he had the power to say, okay, I'll take these 4 legions, you're coming with me, because he's one of the 3. And then they're like, oh, well, I guess that's our general.
It was sanctioned by the state. He was given an official position to do this, to go off to Parthia. But it was because Caesar and Pompey agreed, and their allies allowed him to get all these resources that he needed for this sort of grand conquest.
Right.
So just a lot of dealing and wheeling to make it all happen.
Now, you mentioned with his slaves, obviously there's like a lot of human history in different places. There's a history of slavery within ancient Rome. And we'll get to gladiators and stuff like that later. But how was it determined that people would become slaves? Because it's like they conquer all these areas, and these places become a part of the empire. So obviously a lot of people who live there aren't slaves, but then they get slaves. So who became a slave and why?
There are many ways. So during the conquest of that empire, a lot of people are enslaved. A lot of Greeks are enslaved. A lot of Syrians are enslaved. And their descendants, most of them, remain slaves for centuries. People can be freed much more readily in the Roman system than they could, say, in the American South later on, because Roman slavery is not racial, among other things.
Right. It seems hard to keep track of.
Well, and it was. There's a famous debate in the Senate where they wanted to know, they want slaves to wear an identifying badge or something, so they know who's a slave. And they're like, wait a minute, they'll know how many of them there are. They'll know their own. They'll know their own numbers, which are probably in the hundreds of thousands around Rome.
Yeah.
A single Roman family could have 300 slaves, a wealthy household, and a big estate could have thousands. And that's at the high end, of course. Most Romans don't have so many, but it is possible. Anyway, so people become slaves because they're enslaved initially when the empire's expanding, and their descendants are slaves unless they're freed. You inherit the status of your mother legally. Your mom's a slave, you're a slave. There's other ways. They raid outside the empire around like the Black Sea, for example, what's now the Ukraine. That gets heavily raided for slaves. They go east into Parthia. They go south into Nubia, all over the place. And there's internal slavery too. People who kidnap travelers and enslave them. It's kind of one of these horror stories that happens to travelers. Is you always you're afraid of being kidnapped while you're off on a lonely road, and chained in a workhouse where slaves spend their whole lives in the dark, making stuff for some rich guy. That happens. So there's a lot of
Could happen to like anyone. I mean, that's the scary part in Gladiator. Like that's kind of an example. Like he's asleep on his estate. Some guys come up and boom, he's a slave.
Yeah, and they're called ergastula, these slave workhouses, and that happens. But for the most part, it seems to be biological increase. Just there are a lot of slaves at the start of the imperial era, and they have a lot of kids who are slaves by default. The usual estimate, and it's just an estimate, is that about 10% of the empire's population was slave.
That almost seems low.
And it might be. There are definitely times, like during the conquest of the rest of the Mediterranean world, where Rome and Italy are overflowing with slaves, where the price is incredibly low for a slave. But during the imperial era, when there's fewer wars of conquest, it seems like 10% is roughly about what we're probably dealing with.
Right.
And that's still probably 7 or 8 million people. That's a lot of people.
What was outside? I mean, there's different types and stuff. Like you just mentioned the ones working in a dark room chained to a desk.
Right.
That's different. But what was the life of a typical Roman slave like in Rome? Like some of them, did they get to behave as if they were free, but they're technically owned by someone? How did it work?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, there is no typical Roman slave, right? There's a huge range of outcomes. In the countryside, it's generally harsher. They're harvesting the fields, they're cutting down weeds, they're taking grapes and olives off their vines and trees. And it's rare for you to get freed if you're working on a country estate. But in the city, where you're in much closer touch with your masters, where you're working in a household, then there's a much greater chance you'll be freed and have a lot of scope for agency. So often, owners actually train their slaves, educate them to a highly lucrative career. They'll make them, my slave is a good leather worker. My slave can dress meat for banquets. And they'll rent them out, basically. In some cases, to incentivize the slave, they'll get to keep a portion of their earnings and use that money eventually to buy their own freedom. And so a lot of slaves, their trajectory is that they're bought by the master, trained in some skill, then perform that skill on their master's behalf on kind of a semi-independent basis, buy their own freedom, and then remain as a freedman, sort of an associate of their former master.
Right.
But their kids then are free and with no scruples. They can become consul if they want. And there are a couple emperors who are sons of slaves.
Really?
Which is pretty remarkable. Even Diocletian, the famous reformer, was probably the son of a slave.
That's wild. So there's upward mobility seriously in Roman society.
And actually, interestingly, slaves in the city of Rome have more mobility than most provincials who are free do. Because there's just chances. You have access to power and to powerful people if you're a slave of that powerful person that the average provincial guy on his farm doesn't have.
Wow. So I guess the confusing part to me, though, is if they don't base it on race, so it's not physically attributable, and you don't have pictures back then, you don't have massive social communication, I never understand how it's not so easy for literally every slave to run away.
Well, it does happen.
It definitely happens, but why doesn't it happen with all of them?
I think the most obvious answer might be that for many slaves in these positions where they have enough freedom to get away, they have more incentive to stay and play it by the book and get freedom from their master than to go live on the lam and be, off the grid. Because if they play by the rules and get freed in due course, they'll have their master's patronage, they'll have resources, they'll have wealth. But if they run away, they'll be a landless refugee. And so for people who have enough power and agency to get away easily, they probably see into the future and say, okay, if I wait a few more years, I don't like this very much, but I'll have a much better life, or a much better shot at a better life if I wait it out. But if you're out in the fields, your life's going to be terrible anyway,
Right.
There, the problem is that where do you go? I mean, there's just more and more states. You can get into the mountains maybe, but if you're in the middle of Sicily, for example, there are a few great slave rebellions. When there are the most slaves in the late Republic, when they've conquered all these territories and there are tens of thousands pouring into Italy every year, that's when the three big slave wars happen. And the last of those is the war with Spartacus. The first two were on Sicily, and they involved probably upwards of 100,000 slaves in each case who, got free, killed their masters, and rampaged around. But the Romans sent the legions, and of course the legions butchered all of them, and that was the end of that. Spartacus, famously, was a gladiator, but who escaped from a school near Capua, not too far from Naples, and eventually had well over 100,000 slaves following him all over the south of Italy. He tried to escape, supposedly, make a deal with the pirates, get out of Italy, but, that's might be hearsay. He never did get out of Italy, and was eventually hunted down by Crassus in cooperation with Pompey. So the thing is that revolt on any scale, large or small, isn't probably going to work. And it's hard to get away. There are slave catchers, there's branding, there's chains. And so it's difficult.
Branding.
There is branding and tattooing. Actually, tattooing is, first found on a large scale in this period in Europe. And it's almost entirely for slaves. You tattoo a slave who's tried to escape.
How realistic was it in Gladiator when he had the mark of the Roman legion on his shoulder? Was that something they did as well?
They did that later on. It's like in the later Roman period when soldiers often tried to go AWOL and escape from the legions because it was a pretty bad lot.
Right.
They began to tattoo soldiers with the names of their units. And so they're probably 100 years ahead of themselves there in Gladiator.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.